some kind of Pesach, even in spite of all of the incredible challenges and pain that we've been experiencing in our community and with COVID in the world, everything. But I'm very, oh, there's more people coming in. Just want to officially welcome everybody to our first Friday on Thursday program, and just acknowledge the committee under Stephanie Greenberg's leadership who put together such wonderful programs month after month. And we've pretty much had a program every first Friday on Thursday, every first Thursday, however we say that, but Stephanie and Barbara and Lois and Jody.
And Judy Lemberger.
Judy Lemberger. Yeah. So thank you all. Next month, actually, I've just had a text confirming our May program. So a friend of mine who is she is an associate law professor at CU, and she is a very interesting person. She's known very well by the Lowensteins and other people in our community, and she's actually a Muslim scholar as well as a legal scholar, and her field has really been about comparative studies in halakha and sharia, in Jewish law and Islamic law. And she's actually studied extensively Talmud at JTS, a rabbinical school. And so I think her title is going to be Reflections of a Muslim Scholar Studying Talmud. So that's going to be on May 6th. That's our next first Friday on Thursday program, and it is during Ramadan. So she will be fasting all day. But I want to again welcome everybody and just say, yes, as someone had mentioned, the timing of this with different events. I was very moved actually today. I was watching the recording of the memorial service for Officer Eric Talley, and on the one side, and that pain that we've experienced in our community here in Boulder, and I think some very positive things happening in our policing in Boulder. Maybe we'll see if he agrees with that. But then on the other hand, of course, the trial going on of Chauvin in Minneapolis, it's just like the timing feels very relevant. And of course, there's some people in our community have been very active in some of these issues, but very excited to welcome Hillary Cohen Eizenman, who was born and raised here. And as we were just hearing, some of us, she's a 5th generation Jewish Coloradan, which is rare to find, I think. And her parents, Barbara Cohen, who's here and who I have the honor of co-leading our writing group with, and her late father, Morris Cohen, who I knew pretty well, were founding members of Bonnet. And Hillary has practiced law as a criminal defense attorney for 10 years, 6 of which were as a public defender. And she graduated from the University of Colorado Law School, received a Master of Science in Human Rights from the London School of Economics in my hometown, and graduated summa cum laude from University of Pennsylvania with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and minors in Afro-American Studies and in French. So quite a CV. And one of the things that I love about Hillary's biography is that she met her husband Daniel at a Rosh Hashanah lunch at Bonnet Shalom. Don't know how many years ago that was, but I always remember that story, that one of the very positive things that came out of our Rosh Hashanah gatherings together at Bonnet Shalom. So it's really, really lovely to have you with us, Hillary, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. We'll ask just for Hillary just to make her whole presentation, I think, without interruption or questions during it, but afterwards we can definitely, you're open to our questions and comments, I assume, afterwards. But so thank you for being with us tonight, Hillary, and welcome everybody.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi, for that warm welcome, and thank you all for for coming and joining us here in this space where we can discuss these issues. It's fun to see so many of you that I know, and thank you for being here. So, and Rabbi, it was 15 years ago that I met Daniel at B'nai Shalom for Rosh Hashanah. So that is also quite a highlight, well, obviously of my life, but of B'nai. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. Just one moment. Hold on. Okay, does everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes. All right, I'm gonna play this, hold on. Okay, so the topic tonight is race and the criminal justice system, or as I have written here, the criminal injustice system. And then the subtitle is From the Curse of Ham to the New Jim Crow, How Can We Overcome? So that's quite a bit there. There's a lot to swallow. And so really, we're gonna be talking about a number of topics which span some millennia. So we're not gonna get through everything that's ever happened, but I do wanna talk about some of the kind of the origins of racism and then how they manifest today in the criminal justice system. All right, so let's talk about race. What it is not. If any of you have seen this show, Bridgerton on Netflix, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it doesn't matter. It's really a show where in Regency England, they have overcome racism essentially, and it's essentially a colorblind society. If you see on the right side, maybe it's your left, but on my right side, the Queen herself is Black and interracial marriage is okay. That's Regency England, but reality is very much different. We're still dealing with race and racism and, perhaps always will. On the left here, we have the couple that were the couple at issue in the Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia. They were married outside of Virginia because it was illegal for them to be married. They were an interracial couple. Their name actually is Mr. and Mrs. Loving. They were married and tried to move back to Virginia. They were banned from the state. And the Supreme Court of the United States struck down anti-misogyny laws. That was in 1967. Well, and here we have Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, and they're discussing race and racism with Oprah Winfrey. And it's a topic it's not going anywhere. So let's talk about the moment we're in and how far have we come. The rabbi mentioned that the trial of Derek Chauvin is going on this week. And this photo here is from, I believe, Selma in the civil rights era. Police killings, that is not anything new, but it is something we see all the time now. We're seeing it in the media pretty much on a daily or weekly basis, especially a couple of years ago. It felt like every single week there was another killing of a Black or brown woman or man at the hands of the police. And we're seeing it because it's being videotaped. It's being filmed by bystanders. It's in body camera. So we're able to see it much more clearly now, but it's nothing new. We have our own cases here in Colorado, which have, some have been pretty highlighted in the media, others have not. Virendra Thakuri, I knew him somewhat, but I know his mother. He was a Nepalese immigrant here in Colorado. He was killed by police, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And of course, Elijah McClain, who's been in the national media. And then Jessica Hernandez, she was a 16-year-old Hispanic girl who was shot in Denver because she was fleeing the police in a car and they shot at the car. So let's talk about Black Lives Matter. When does this enter the national discourse? In 2013, it was in response, these three women started it as a hashtag in response to George Zimmerman being acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin. And Trayvon Martin, this is, I believe, in 2012, he was visiting family in Florida. He was walking home from a convenience store with Skittles, and a iced tea. He was wearing a hoodie, and George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watchman, approached him, started a fight. He was the initial aggressor, but claimed that it was Trayvon who assaulted him. It took 6 weeks for him to even be arrested after he killed Trayvon Martin, who was a young boy. 6 weeks to even be arrested, and it required media, national media. President Barack Obama spoke about it. The governor had to appoint a special prosecutor. It took the national media to get even George Zimmerman to be arrested. And then he was acquitted, which was shocking because he turned the narrative of himself being the initial aggressor into being the victim. These are some of the most iconic images of Black Lives Matter, the movement, and how police have responded to either Black protesters or protesters supporting a cause of equality for Blacks and not being killed by the police. And then we had the events of a few weeks ago, the attempted coup on our Capitol by Trump supporters. This was a shocking and tragic day and extremely depressing because of the double standard that we saw, where on one side of this screen, you see a response to Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, full militarized gear, and then the assault in the Capitol where they were not prepared. And certainly some officers were heroic and they tried to stop the assault, but you see these images of white men roaming through the Capitol like it's a joke and getting away with it, not being arrested until afterwards because, of course, there wasn't enough of a police force, but it was like not a single one was injured. And the double standard was extremely depressing. So how did we get here? This is a depiction of Noah and his sons observing him naked. So the curse of Ham in Genesis, it says that Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father Noah, his nakedness, and Noah awoke from his wine. He knew what his small son had done to him, and he said, "Cursed be Canaan, he shall be a slave among slaves to his brethren." This has been used throughout history to justify slavery and to justify a religious basis for Black people being slaves. However, the Bible or the Torah does not say anything about Ham or Canaan's race. And certainly I'll leave it to the rabbi to someday discuss why the punishment does not seem to fit the crime. But the curse initially was, it was for slavery, but there was nothing that said Ham or Canaan was Black. Throughout history, there has been some interpretation that the Hebrew word meant dark or Black, and there was some Judeo-Christian interpretation that Black and slave were the same. But David Goldenberg, who is a scholar, and I had a class from him at University of Pennsylvania, his work has been about where did this duality of Blackness and slavery, so racism based on a race or a color and slavery become conflated and synonymous. And his work has shown that there was this huge slave trade of Black Africans to the Islamic world in the 7th century. And it went on for a few hundred years, where 12 to 14 million slaves from Africa were brought to the Islamic world. And at this time, the notion that the curse of Ham was a curse of slavery and Blackness linked, and it became synonymous. And so this is, according to my professor, this is the start, the historical origins of widespread racism based on color. Takes on prominence with the European slave trade, and then it comes to the colonies in America. And in the United States, we have had this paradox since our founding that all men are created equal, but the only way that could survive alongside slavery was through racism. And so white supremacy and racism became the justification for slavery, and that whites were dominant, blacks were inferior, and to preserve the social hierarchy, racism is indoctrinated into the country and into our laws. It's in the Constitution. They never actually wrote the words race or black in the Constitution, but Black men and women were considered 3/5 of a person when they were writing the Constitution and to come up with apportionment. So really, race has been built into the fabric of American society and our democracy. And you have the Enlightenment ideas and egalitarian ideas, and they go alongside and hand in hand with racism. And I have some quotes here from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. So let's talk about the criminal justice system. So what we've had for centuries is essentially two dual systems of justice. What we have here on one side is the Scottsboro boys. They were ages 13 to 19. I think there were 7 of them or 9 of them. It was in the 30s. They were, it was the Depression. They were caught riding a train. That was a common way to get around for poor people to jump on a train. And there was some sort of assault that may have taken place, or something happened, police were called, and then all of a sudden there's an allegation that 2 white women were raped by these boys ages 13 to 19. They were all tried and sentenced to death. Their cases went up to the Supreme Court and back down again, and they were retried and sentenced to death and went back to the Supreme Court. We got 2 landmark Supreme Court cases out of it. And this was part of the inspiration for Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. But they were convicted by all white juries without adequate legal representation. And that's what those 2 cases were about, based on the allegation of raping a white woman. That didn't happen. And then on the other side of the screen, we have Emmett Till. He was a young Black boy who went to Mississippi to visit family. He was in a grocery store, maybe winked at a woman or whatever. She thought he looked at her weird. She accused him of trying to come on to her, and her husband and his friends tortured and killed him. They were acquitted for the murder of Emmett Till by an all-white jury. So the criminal justice system, I've kind of laid out here all the kind of the pieces to it and the phases of it. And in each of these areas and phases, race and poverty come to play. So the first thing is police contact, and we're going to get into that in a minute. And then there's the charging decision. So whether a crime has occurred, and that can be based on the laws. And it's also based on whether the police believe there should be charges, and also whether the prosecutor does. And they have discretion there. They can look the other way, they can charge, or they can use their discretion to decide it's not worth it. Pretrial detention, which we'll talk about more in depth. Access to counsel, which is huge, but, and that's one of my areas of expertise, but it's too big to really cover. But access to counsel and adequate counsel is huge. Plea bargaining and trial. So whether a person accepts a plea could be based on what kind of counsel they have, whether they're in pretrial custody, and then also leverage prosecutors have, and mandatory minimums and sentencing laws, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then sentencing, of course, there's sentencing disparity, and then the collateral consequences of conviction. Think becoming a felon and losing certain rights, perhaps federal assistance in housing, stigma, voting rights, things of that nature. Now, police contact, this is kind of where a case can start. What we have here is this woman, if you remember, I think it was this past summer, Miss Cooper called the police on a Black man because he told her to put her dog on a leash in Central Park. And she, on the 911 call, said a Black man is accosting me or whatever. And she used race as a weapon. So I wrote here the 911 caller, that is important. And then white collar crime. We've seen so many incidents of people calling the police for men and women for existing while Black. On the other photograph, we have this man being arrested, I think it was in Seattle, arrested by the police for sitting in a Starbucks because he was waiting for a friend and had not ordered a drink. And the staff at Starbucks called the police, and then they had to do all this diversity training. But calling the police on a minority for nothing could be based on implicit or unconscious bias, but it can also be more nefarious and using race or leveraging animus towards minorities, leveraging that with the police. And then a case can also start with police contact, so observing the crime or alleged crime, and of course, racial profiling is a problem, and a Black person is 5 times more likely to be stopped without just cause than a white person. So this can have dire consequences. In 1921, a 19-year-old Black man, Dick Rowland, tripped in an elevator in an office building, touched a white female elevator attendant, and this is the headline the next day. He was arrested, and the accusation went from touching, assaulting to, again, sexual assault. This is a constant theme. And I believe it was Black veterans from World War I went to the courthouse to protect him because they feared that there would be a lynching. And instead of a lynching, it turned into a massacre. So this is, if you saw the HBO show recently, I don't remember the name, but they depict the race massacre in this recent HBO show, which I'll think of, where hundreds were killed. Black Wall Street was a very successful neighborhood where the Black community was actually doing extremely well. They were wealthy, oil was booming, there was a lot of jealousy over that. Their entire neighborhood was destroyed. Houses were destroyed, people were orphaned, and there were actually bombs dropped on American soil because the whites in the area used crop dusting airplanes to drop homemade bombs. And this is part of the aftermath. So calling the police on a person, as it can have, as we've seen, especially recently with all the Black men and women being killed by police, it can have dire consequences. And I mentioned we would talk about Virendra Thakuri a little bit. He was killed by police in Colorado when, a person heard 2 people fighting or yelling behind his house at night, called the police. One can ask, was it really necessary for that person to call the police? They didn't mean to do anything wrong, but you think the police are here to help. They called the police, and one of the men was having a mental health crisis, and the police officer shot him to death. So it's something to think about, and we'll come back to it. The next areas of the criminal justice system, pretty much race and poverty affect every aspect. So I put this quote here from Brian Stevenson: "The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice." So pretrial incarceration, that is bail. And whether a person can post bail often depends upon whether they have any money and how high bail is set. So 74% of people held in jail are not convicted of anything. They are waiting for trial. Pretrial detention, even for a day, if you're a person living kind of hand to mouth, and you're in a service job or a menial job, unlike an office job where you don't get, days off here and there, if you can't call in to your boss because you're incarcerated and you can't even reach them on the phone, you're going to lose your job probably in one day. There can be loss of housing. People are more likely to face deportation if they're incarcerated prior to trial and they also have a deportation case going on, and then they're more likely to plead guilty. They're also more likely to be sentenced to jail or prison. So if 2 people come into court, they plead guilty to the same thing, but one is wearing street clothes and he's out of custody versus the other who's in jail. The person who's in jail is more likely to receive jail as a sentence. And they're also more likely to commit crime again. I'm going to show you a clip from a movie called American Violet.
The county have a recommendation on bail, Mr. Beckett?
County says Mr. Lee Ray has a flight risk, Your Honor. Like bail.
Oh,
He said to $50,000.
We hear the audio, but we don't see the video.
oh, really?
Court appoints Mr. David Higgins as your lawyer.
Okay, one sec.
$50,000. This is a preliminary hearing on your case for March 23rd.
Is that better? Can you see that? No?
You need to no, you need to reshare your screen.
Okay, one sec.
Yes, sir.
Are you aware of the charges that are being brought against you by Harmon County, Ms. Roberts?
I think I'm here for my parking tickets.
Ms. Roberts, you charged with distributing narcotics in a school zone. Is that correct, Mr. Beckett?
It is, Your Honor.
That can't be right. I never had anything to do with drugs.
Well, I take that as a not guilty plea. Can you afford an attorney, Ms. Roberts?
No, sir.
Now we have a recommendation on bail, Mr. Beckett.
Selling drugs in school zones is a very serious charge, Your Honor. County recommends bail at $70,000.
Ms. Roberts, court appoints Mr. David Higgins as your lawyer. Sets bail at $70,000. Schedules a preliminary hearing on your case for March 23rd.
Okay. 1 second, let me get the PowerPoint back up. Okay. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Okay. 1 second. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Everybody back on the same page? Yes? Thumbs up?
Yep.
Mom, thumb up? Okay. All right. So that's a intense scene to watch. That movie is fantastic. I recommend you watch it if you can. It's called American Violet. It's all about bail. And in that movie, the cops were planting drugs in a housing project in Houston. And, you know, when someone's in custody without means to post bail, it's so coercive that they will often plead guilty. Whether or not they did it and whether or not it's to a felony that's going to affect them. And the people in that movie who are facing this choice are in federal housing. And if you're convicted of possessing or distributing drugs, you're going to be kicked out of federal housing. And so the protagonist in that movie, that woman, refuses to plead guilty to something she didn't do. And it's about the system of bail and how coercive it is. So this is kind of a big slide here, but this system of mass incarceration is really poverty and race are tied up with the criminal justice system at every aspect. So the sentencing laws and the laws which punish crime, you know, there's been so much tough on crime legislation and mandatory minimums, which can be coercive. And then people are faced with this choice of whether to plead guilty or face potentially a trial penalty, which is being sentenced more harshly because they're exercising their right to go to trial, or because that's what the charges they are facing are. And if they're convicted at trial, they will face something harsher than if they took something slightly less in a plea bargain. And so while the world has 5% of the population, or excuse me, while the US has 5% of the world's population, we have nearly 25% of its incarcerated population. And so today we have 2.2 million people incarcerated. And there is a statistic that I've seen criticized, but it's the NAACP and ACLU and the EJI all say that 1 out of every 3 Black boys born today can expect to be sentenced to prison. And there's a huge disparity also when it comes to the war on drugs. And sadly, there's a number of wrongful convictions in our system, which can be the product of false confessions, exclusion of DNA that would have eliminated the person as a suspect, segregated juries, inadequate legal counsel, and prosecutorial malfeasance. So 58% of the people the Innocence Project has freed for wrongful convictions have been Black. Curtis Flowers, he went to trial 6 times. He was wrongfully charged and convicted for a quadruple homicide in Mississippi, same town where Emmett Till stopped when he was killed. Curtis Flowers, well, the evidence was essentially manufactured by a prosecutor there who is one of the most unethical prosecutors probably ever in the history of the US, but he manufactured evidence with his investigators against Curtis Flowers. And then each successive trial kept Black people off the jury. And the trial kept going up and down the court. So it went to the Mississippi Supreme Court, overturned, back down, tried. And this lasted for about 20 years. He was sentenced to death each time, or it mistried and it was a hung jury. Finally, after his 6th trial, the Supreme Court this last summer overturned his conviction. It was actually Judge Kavanaugh, because they were able to see that the prosecutor, the same one that was manufacturing evidence, was systematically keeping Black jurors off the jury. And this podcast, In the Dark, they actually compiled the evidence of the systematic exclusion of Blacks, not just in that case, but in the entire judicial district. Ray Hinton is also a very classic example of a miscarriage of justice. He was sentenced, or he served about 20 years also for murders he did not commit. It was all based on this allegation that a gun that he had was linked to this other murder that he did not do, and I believe he had an alibi for. He had inadequate legal assistance. They hired an expert witness for their ballistics expert who was actually blind, which didn't help things at all. But he served many, many years. And in Colorado, we have our own quite shocking case of a wrongful conviction. And I need to share my screen to that, I believe. One moment.
When school isn't a place you have to be, why not go to school where remote learning can be as remote as you want? Some plants are found hiking. Here we have
And spent 28 years in prison for a rape conviction only to be acquitted. He is smiling because he's now out and getting a big financial payout for all that lost time. Today, the Colorado Attorney General granted an exoneration petition from Clarence Moses L. Our CBS 4 investigator talked to him today and reports tonight from the 5 Points area where that crime occurred. Rick?
Jim, Clarence Moses L. was a very happy man when I spoke to him today. What a life he's had. Some 3 decades behind bars, and now he's to become an instant millionaire 2 times over. After 28 years in prison, Clarence Moses L. was given a trial.
I've lost the sound.
Okay. Just a moment. So Clarence Moses Eel was convicted of a rape. It actually occurred. The rape did occur. She just had a dream about who did it. So she was violently raped. However, did not know who did it and just had a dream, and it was Clarence Moseseel, who was her neighbor. And in her dream, she thought it was him. They destroyed the evidence, and sadly, the man who did commit the rape, eventually he did confess, and he was serving a sentence for another rape. But it took years, and the prosecutors in Denver opposed freeing Clarence, and he had to go through a second trial. So what can we do? What reforms can be instituted to make sure these miscarriages of justice do not continue? Big and small, really. So you've heard a lot about defund the police. This is a graphic from Ben & Jerry's about what defund the police really means. It doesn't mean nobody wants police. Of course, they're necessary, but there needs to be a complementary service to them. So this shows that their money should be divided amongst other players: affordable housing, job training, education, mental health counseling, and substance abuse treatment. Also, the police need to be held accountable. So the first point I have here is stop coercive tactics that produce false confessions. And if any of you have seen the Netflix show about the Central Park Five, I actually can't bring myself to watch it, but the Central Park Five, they were all juveniles. They were coerced into confessing to a rape that they did not do. And this happens. People confess to crimes they didn't do all the time. And a lot of the men freed from the Innocence Project have confessed to crimes they didn't commit. And a lot of that has to do with police tactics, especially when there are juveniles involved. And police are allowed to use different tactics. They can lie to a suspect to achieve a confession, which is not necessarily producing reliable results. There needs to be internal discipline and oversight, body cameras, reform qualified immunity, which is basically a civil doctrine about when you can sue the police and not, and then criminal prosecution. So I'm sure you've all heard the expression, you can indict a ham sandwich. But when it comes to police killing unarmed Black men and women that's been going on, we see them constantly bringing it to a grand jury and saying, I couldn't get an indictment, couldn't do it. And I think there's a lot of prosecutors that throw the case. They could bring charges either without a grand jury, or they could bring evidence to a grand jury to indict people like Breonna Taylor. When that went to a grand jury, a number of the jurors afterwards said, we didn't hear certain evidence, and we didn't know they were trying to get a murder charge. So there needs to be more of that. Prosecutorial reform. They also need to hold the police accountable. So when a police officer gets charges or gets evidence that are improper, so improperly obtaining a confession, improperly obtaining evidence, or charging something there's no evidence to support, prosecutors need to have the backbone to say, I'm not bringing that case. But there's often this kind of, they work together. They're colleagues. They have a professional relationship, and they're often not willing to say to the police, I'm not bringing that. Hogwash. There is too much in the criminal justice system. There are too many laws, too many things are criminalized, and too much is brought that shouldn't be. And then they need to use discretion to dump cases, especially if the person's innocent. I've had prosecutors say, innocent people get misdemeanors. And so what does that mean? They're saying, if your client's innocent, if they want to plea, they can get a misdemeanor, but I'm not dropping their case. So they can either go to trial, let's say it's something serious, they could go to trial and face potentially very serious charges, or they can plead to a misdemeanor, but innocent people get misdemeanors. And so I put a progressive prosecutor here, Larry Krasner, who is in Philadelphia. He used to be a public defender. He is now the kind of the reformer in Philadelphia. He has stopped using the death penalty. He has a conviction integrity unit. He is reducing the use of cash bail, limiting time on parole or probation. and their amount of prosecutions is decreasing significantly. And in COVID as well. And so we're seeing that COVID is actually having a couple helpful benefits for criminal justice. So this slide talks about the headline there is from is based on District of Columbia. They've stopped prosecuting misdemeanors, except for violent misdemeanors. And since COVID, they've stopped and they have not seen an increase in crime. Baltimore did this as an experiment during COVID, and they are going to keep doing it. So Baltimore is going to stop prosecuting low-level, non-violent offenses like drug possession, prostitution, public urination, and open containers. And the prosecutor there in Maryland said, the drug war in Baltimore is going to stop, because it does only, it's prosecuting people who are addicts, and it's mostly prosecuting people of color. And I will go back, I've seen so many stupid cases in my life. I saw a case where a woman threw a package of raw meat at a man and was charged with a crime. I mean, really, is this necessary? So let's talk about the reforms that Colorado is doing right now. We've had some bail reform, and there's more that needs to be done. But in 2008, the Supreme Court said your right to an attorney, if you can't afford one, to have an appointed attorney starts when you go to court your very first time. So in that video of American Violet, we saw this woman in court with no representation, having her bail set at $70,000. That could be potentially the most important court appearance she has. But her public defender is appointed after she's already had her bail set. Colorado used to be like that. And then Rothgary happened in 2008, and they had to change the law, appoint a whole bunch more public defender, find the money for many more public defenders. And part of our job was then to get up early in the morning. About once or twice a month, I'd have to be at the Adams County Jail at 7 in the morning, which is an hour away, and meet, 20 to 50 people, find out their life story, and argue bail for them. And that is hugely important. While, many of them did still have a cash bail that was set, however. So more can be done. This past year, there was a reform bill that was proposed, and it was postponed, but it was to have a bail hearing within 48 hours of arrest. And believe it or not, you can be arrested and not go before a judge. So I had a case where I actually testified in support of this bill to the legislature last summer. Well, I guess it was 2 summers ago. It was before COVID. I had a client, she was a woman, she was living her life. She had a boyfriend, they broke up. She comes to find later, she's driving in Grand Junction. She gets a speeding ticket, and she finds out she has a warrant for her arrest because he accused her of breaking into his house and slashing his bed. She's arrested and she's put in a Mesa County jail. The judge there wouldn't set her bail because he said, it's a Boulder case, I'm not touching it. And it took her 2 weeks to be brought to Boulder and to have her bail set. And I tried so many things to get her brought here, but everyone was saying their hands were tied. Eventually, 2 weeks later, she made it to Boulder, and she was granted no bail, or no cash bail. It's called a personal recognizance bond. It means you get out by signing your name. She had no criminal history. Prosecutors didn't even charge the case. So they did the right thing there. They said, there's actually no evidence to support this. We're not bringing a case. So a woman who's eventually not charged with a crime spent 2 weeks of her life in a jail in Grand Junction because she wasn't brought before a judge. That bill still needs to happen. And there is another bill that was postponed, but it's to basically make the presumption that everyone is out without having to post a cash bond unless there is extenuating circumstances. Police reform. So recently, Denver did this experiment that they're going to keep doing, and it's called the Support Team Assisted Response, so STAR. they have these vans, I think they had two. They go around Denver and they're able to respond to nonviolent situations with a mental health professional or a social worker, paramedic. And if someone's in crisis, they can handle the situation without bringing in the police and without a person being arrested. This was a pilot program, but it's going to continue. And I think a lot of other places are considering doing this. And this is fantastic, especially if you have a large population of homeless people or people experiencing addiction. This is really great. And Colorado passed a very, very comprehensive Police Accountability Act last summer. It was in June, so Juneteenth 2020, it passed. It was signed by the governor right in the midst of the summer of protests. And it eliminates qualified immunity for police. It requires all police departments to have body cameras as of 2023. And so I'll go back. Barendra Thakuri, who was killed by the police in Westminster, there was no body camera. But this bill also regulates how protests are policed and what kind of projectiles they can use. It bans the use of chokeholds, and it also has kind of a bystander prohibition. So the police in George Floyd's case, who stood by as Derek Chauvin choked the life out of George Floyd, in Colorado, going forward, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. They'd have to step in. For collateral consequences, Colorado has done some reforms. We have the Chance to Compete Act. So it's called Ban the Box legislation. It means that when an employer is asking an applicant about themselves on their initial application, they can't ask if they have a criminal history. They can later, not initially. And also, Colorado does not prohibit felons from voting. It's only while they're on supervision. We became the 22nd state to abolish the death penalty, and this happened last summer. These were the three men on our death row at the time, all Black men, all prosecuted out of the same office in Arapahoe County. Their sentences were commuted to life, and we ended the death penalty, which was, imposed in a racially inconsistent manner, and Virginia just became the 23rd state. Curtis Brooks is an example of a strange legal doctrine called felony murder, which there is a bill right now that is in our legislature trying to make changes to felony murder. He was convicted at age 15. He was part of a group of boys. I think he had just met them. And they were like, let's go rob someone. He went with them. One of the participants killed the victim, not Curtis. But this doctrine of felony murder says that even if you are not the person who does it, if you're with other people and you're participating in a felony together and someone gets killed, even if no one intended it, you're responsible, just like they are. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment at the age of 15. And Governor Polis granted him clemency this past summer. So felony murder is, there's racial disparities in how it's applied and how it's sought. It also, so it's life in prison if you're convicted of that. There is a bill right now that just passed the Senate in Colorado. It has to go to the House, and it changes it from a life sentence to something where you can get parole after a certain period of time, and it expands the defense. So if you didn't engage in the conduct or intend to engage in any conduct likely to result in someone's death, you cannot be responsible. So what can we all do? There is a lot that we can all do to examine our own selves. I remember the rabbi's sermon, I think it was last Rosh Hashanah, about understanding our own implicit biases, and we all have them. And also, really, I encourage you to think about what it means to call 911. And that's kind of sad. I think we should all want to be able to live in a world where we can call the police if we think we need to, but maybe they don't need to be the babysitters. Maybe they don't need to come in and wag their finger. because that's not really their job. That's not what they do. They're not babysitters. They're not the noise police. They are armed police officers who are looking to see whether crimes have been committed. And so perhaps they don't always need to be involved. And I think we should all encourage our legislature to continue policies of decarceration and bail and sentencing reform. And there are bills that are working their way through the legislature right now if you, feel like supporting those. So, and I also encourage you to watch some of these movies we've talked about. And that is what I have. If you'd like to, we can talk about it.
Thank you so much, Hilary. It was very informative and very well presented. I feel like seeing as you talked about movies and you mentioned Brian Stevenson, but didn't mention the book and movie that was made of the book. I think that's should also be on the list, Just Mercy, which is a really wonderful book and movie about mostly Alabama and the justice system there. But hello, do people have questions, comments? There's quite a lot of people here, so I don't know if you want to raise your hand, if you want to ask Hilary something, or if you want to make a comment, you can use the raise hand feature, or just if you're sharing your video, you can physically raise your hand. Stephanie.
Hilary, this might be a little bit off to the side, but I'd really like to get your thoughts about that horrendous occurrence in Manhattan just the other day, where a middle-aged Asian American woman was violently attacked and beaten to the point of needing hospitalization by a man who while he was beating her up, called her racial epithets. And no one, not one person, came to her aid, and perhaps not even one person called 911. I'm not sure about that last part, but not a single person came to her aid. And there were lots of people around watching, seeing what was happening. And there were two, I think, building guards right next to, in front of a building, right next to where that was happening. Yeah. Not one person came to her aid. Not one person, I think, called 911. As citizens, how do we deal with something that horrendous? Because I do remember the Kitty Genovese. You weren't born, but I do remember Kitty Genovese. There's been some questions about the authenticity of how that was presented. But anyway, that was a long time ago. Purportedly a similar situation.
Well, I don't know if I'm the expert on this. I do remember that psychological, research after that incident where that woman was killed and no one did anything. I haven't followed the situation in New York very closely, so I don't know all the facts of that. But I think we have, progress comes in waves, and we see backlash when there's progress. So of course, after slavery, there was some progress, and then there was backlash, and there was Jim Crow, and then there was some progress with civil rights, and then there was backlash with really heavy sentencing laws. And then we had some progress, I think, with Barack Obama, and now we have the Trump era. And I think that's just gonna be our reality for a little while. And racism and distrust of other groups is really high right now.
I'd like to address the question Stephanie brought up, since you haven't, Counselor. Aren't we, you've just in your talk said we shouldn't be calling 911 so quickly. We're seeing that even if it appears that a black person is committing a criminal act, if people seem to intervene, whether it's police or citizens, and they're not minority, very quickly the situation's turned on their head and the perpetrator becomes the victim. So I think people are being trained to let these crimes go. It's from the police being trained to look the other way or sit in their squad car when crimes are being committed for fear of being accused of racism for doing their job. It's fear of citizenry being doxxed and harassed for trying to be good citizens because race seems to triumph over common law. So I think people are afraid to intervene.
Do you
So,
have comments on that, Hillary? And then there are 3 people
Yeah.
with their hand raised, and there are also some questions coming up in the chat. So
I think,
can you
you know,
respond to Bob?
yeah, other people may want to chime into this topic, but I think calling the police, of course, if someone's being assaulted, sure, call the police. I'm not saying don't call the police if there's violent crime happening. But even the cashier in the George Floyd incident who received the counterfeit bill and then called the police, and then the police came and killed George Floyd, he had to testify. And I think he looked pained that he made the choice to call the police, which resulted in George Floyd's death. And I think calling the police for stupid stuff is where I'm saying examine it and think about it. And is it necessary?
So,
But
so
other,
what should the threshold be? What kind of crimes should we let go based on the race of the perpetrator? I guess I'm not clear on what are we performing some kind of restorative justice or anti-racism by saying, okay, passing counterfeit bills, dealing drugs, participating in protests that turn violent, we should turn a blind eye? If that's the case, people aren't going to call when an Asian woman's being beat up by a black man. The police could have come and hurt him, and then we have a new cause for riots. You know, the lady only suffered a black eye, but maybe trying to arrest that man, he would have been killed. That would be the logic at that point. So that's why people aren't calling.
Well, she suffered more than a black eye. She had
Well,
a
that's what
cracked
people will
pelvis.
say.
I think that's
You
a
know?
slippery slope argument, Bob, that I would disagree with. My point was, especially looking at the, if you think about Barendra Thakuri, a neighbor called the police not knowing what race anyone was. I did not allege, you know, I'm not saying that the person who called the police thought that there was a black man in their neighborhood that needed the police called, but it was just sort of a innocent situation where the person who called, there was nothing wrong with the person who called the police. They did what they thought to do. They heard some noise and they thought people were fighting in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, it did end in a death. And I think if we combine some of these ideas where we have mental health response instead of just police response to situations, or we have training for police officers of how to deal with a person who's in crisis, I think that helps.
Well, I
Thank
don't
you.
know that that guy was in crisis. He just picked on some lady and beat the crap out of her.
And so you're talking
By
about one thing.
the
and
way,
I'm-
released on parole after killing his mother. So already established as a violent person.
So we're talking
Um,
about different things, but Bob, I think everyone agrees that the hate crime was not a good thing. So Judy
Yeah,
has her
there's
hand up.
Yohanet and Jerry and Rivka had her hand up earlier, and then there's some questions in the chat too. So
Hi, Hillary, are you calling? I didn't know if you're calling
Yeah.
on me or not, but
Yes, hi Jude.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with, well, first I want to address the last speaker. I think that you're missing the point of what Hillary is speaking about, Bob, that calling the police on a Black person is actually threatening their life. And that's not an exaggeration. Every contact with a Black person and police is fraught with danger for that Black person. and white people know that. And white people in Boulder call the police for a Black man walking in a parking lot, Black man existing, driving while Black, many instances. So I would ask you to look at the statistics that Hillary was mentioning of, and maybe you'll understand why she could make a statement like that, which Hillary, you're not the first person to make that statement. The NAACP also urges people to have reflection on when they call the police and why, and what is considered threatening to them. But what I wanted to ask you about was, are you familiar with the reform bill, SB 21062, which is addressing jailing for misdemeanors and cash bail? It's before the legislature and is supported by many many counties in Colorado. Some leaders in Colorado have come out against it. But I wondered if you're familiar with that and you could speak to it, because I think it's important for those interested in reform in advocating for it.
I think it's the same one that I mentioned that I think it is, that it came up last session and then they postponed it to this session. You know, saying that cash bail should not be the norm, that the norm should be released without having to post cash bond. And I absolutely agree with that. The law doesn't go far enough as it is right now. It says now that the presumption is a person should be released with the least restrictive conditions. So basically, if they can post, it should be that they're able to actually post their cash bond. But if a person has no access to money, or they don't even have $400, you know, they're not going to be able to post a bond no matter how high or low. If there's a cash component, they're not going to be able to post it. So I would support that.
I don't know, Hillary, if you're seeing the questions that are coming into the chat, if you want to deal with any of them, and then Jerry has his hand up too, but there's some.
Well, let's do Jerry and then I'll look at the comments
Okay.
too.
Okay.
Hi, first of all, thanks for this incredible presentation and for the work you've been doing. My question deals with the school to prison pipeline and your experiences, if you've had any with it. When I was teaching in the Aurora schools, part of the district is in Adams County. So I knew where, you know, a lot of those kids wound up having to travel to Henderson to deal at that time anyways. I don't know if that's changed. But you mentioned the case of the 15-year-old who was sentenced to death, death, life in prison. When we all know that the average teenage brain does not even fully develop until their mid-20s. So I'd love to hear your comments on school to prison pipeline, and if anything in your mind is being done to try to kind of alleviate it.
I think there's some efforts to get rid of school resource officers and police in schools. There's definitely advocacy for that, for reducing that. I don't do a ton of work in juvenile law. I just don't really want to. I haven't had to do too much of it, but there's also trying juveniles as adults. And that does happen with some frequency, especially in Adams County. I saw it where they would, you know, charge a juvenile with a serious crime, but as an adult, and then they can go to adult prison for the rest of their life. So luckily, there have been some reforms with sentencing juveniles to life in prison without considering their unique circumstances and their youthfulness. But I think more work has to be done, but I'm not an expert in that area. I do see a question about the law about body cameras. And so the law as proposed, well, actually, excuse me, the law that passed that's going to require body cameras in 2023, it does have some regulations about when they have to be activated and recording. So if there's interaction with a citizen, they will have to start recording.
There was also a question earlier about how Colorado ranks in terms of police reform compared to the rest of the country. And there's also a question about whether there's been any Asian hate crimes in Colorado. And there's a question from Leah about, did the institution of policing develop in the South to control slave labor?
Yeah, from Leah, I will address that. I think Michelle Alexander's book is really good. The New Jim Crow, it addresses that, how controlling or figuring out what to do with freed slaves after slavery ended. There were slave patrols, which then she says, developed into modern policing and the war on drugs. So I think that's definitely, there's a history behind that. And then, in the South, it's scary. I mean, they still have like chain gangs, so it just doesn't look that different. But comparing Colorado and our reform to other states, I can't really, I don't know how we rank. I do think we're doing some positive things, but it's also, it sometimes depends on the jurisdiction. And Colorado it's a mixed bag. Let's see. I don't know of any hate crimes against Asians recently. I don't know if anyone does, if they want to share.
I'm wondering, Hillary, how much interaction you've had with our new police chief, Maris Herold, and how you see her vision for Boulder policing, because some of us on this call actually had a very positive meeting with her, and her, hearing about her vision for community policing.
I haven't had any interaction with her. With the district attorney, Doherty, I've had a little bit, and I think he's, trying to move Boulder in the right direction. I believe he has a conviction integrity unit. So trying to look at, whether there are people who were wrongfully incarcerated. I think Boulder has some positives. I think it's also a little bit of a conservative place, and it's very, very, very liberal, but also very conservative. I think because of that liberalism, there's this sort of somewhat lack of acceptance of kind of less like liberal or woke ideas. So it becomes in a way very conservative. And I think I see that in my practice, mostly when it relates to crimes that I can't talk about because my children just joined a little bit. But I see very kind of conservative views when it comes to more adult issues. Sis? Hi.
Hi, Bobette.
Hi,
My
everybody
sister's gonna ask.
from New York. Couple things. I just put in the chat that I heard New York City City Council passed a resolution to allow citizens to sue police for violations and get rid of the immunity for police. So hopefully that is going to be passed. And in regards to the Asian woman that was attacked brutally, I don't understand why the doormen who are kind of trained to deal with confrontations, why they didn't do anything. It's totally wrong. I have a feeling maybe the people on the street were scared. It's possible they don't want to get involved in a violent situation, but I'm almost certain that 911 was called, or she wouldn't have been attended to. And I think with COVID, like everybody walking around here is pretty much a little on edge towards other people. So I don't know, it's a terrible thing that happened. I don't know why nobody stepped in. I mean, I don't have a good answer, but that's just sort of the reality here in the city. And one thing I think you forgot, sis, is Rodney King. That whole trial and the injustice that was served and the reaction of society. And, they mentioned it on the news, if that trial goes the same direction, that there's going to be a huge reaction in the country. And So hopefully not.
Yeah, I agree. I did miss that. And I read an op-ed today about the trial of Derek Chauvin, and it's been 30 years since Rodney King. And so how far have we come? We'll see. This case is kind of, it should seem like a no-brainer, but hopefully justice happens. And I know we have a former prosecutor, Joan Nagel, is on. Joan, did I say anything you disagree with or found unfair to law enforcement?
No, it's sort of interesting, and Bill's here too, and he was a prosecutor, but well, one thing I could relate to is when you said that somebody threw some raw meat at somebody and got charged with assault. I had a case once when I was in the charging unit where there was a CU student who had a parking ticket, and she was really upset, and she threw the parking ticket at this guy who happened to be a lawyer, but he was acting as the parking ticket judge at CU, and it caused him to have a paper cut, and he referred it to our office for the filing of third-degree assault because he was cut by this flying parking ticket. We declined prosecution on that one. The thing about charging juveniles as adults, and I think also with the death penalty, the death penalty is a little different, but I think prosecutors often will use the ability to do things in order to get a plea to what really should have happened, should have been charged in the first place. And I did see that happen regularly. The story that you told that upset me, not only because I started my prosecutorial career in Mesa County, was that the DA's office there wouldn't release your client on a PR bond and have her report to Boulder. That's just very, very distressing when I hear stories like that. And I happened to be talking to my nephew, who is a lawyer in Philadelphia, and a lot of people are really unhappy with the new DA there, and the police especially are very, very upset having him be the chief prosecutor for their cases. And it's unlikely that he's going to be reelected. And not only the police, but yeah, that it'll be interesting to see what happens in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and I think there's a progressive prosecutor like Krasner in San Francisco who used to be a public defender. And so, Krasner may not be reelected, but hopefully there is a trend that there's, some mercy that is part of the job. And instead of, always sticking to how far can we prosecute someone, perhaps some mercy and ideas of ways to decarcerate our system would be helpful.
So one thing when I was a prosecutor, one thing that I was inspired to become a prosecutor because there was a brown bag lunch at the CU Law School, and there was a young Black attorney from the Manhattan DA's office. And he said, if you really want to see that justice is done, you should become a DA because you have more power. And then if you see that something has been, a person has been unfairly arrested, or you don't think you can prove the charge, you have the power to file a motion to dismiss, whereas a public defender or a defense attorney is at the mercy of the prosecutor. So I always like to think that I did kind and gentle prosecution. Bill may want to say something. Did you have something to say?
The thing about the bail bond situation, the statute that's being proposed, is interesting to me, very interesting to me, because I was in Philadelphia before I went to law school, before I went to college, I think, and was hired temporarily to go into the Philadelphia County Jail after there was a riot there that led to a bunch of killings, including the warden was killed. And that's what led to the ROR program there, the release on recognizance for minor crimes. And it was really successful. And because they kept a lot of people out, and what they learned was that you also had to appreciate the fact that people were only in jail at that stage to appear for trial. So why did they need to be in jail at all, especially on minor crimes? And so people who appreciated that, even police officers who came to be hired by that unit to go out and search for the people who didn't appear for trial on their warrants, they realized that all they had to do was call the guy up and remind him that he had appearance the next day. And he'd come in, you know, there wasn't a big issue. And now, but in Philadelphia now, it's basically run its course. And it has gotten to where they're overcrowded again with violent crimes and with homicides and with people who have long records. Now, what the root of that is, I don't know. I don't know anything about it. But it's the same problem that will be faced here in 20 years if we're successful in dealing with misdemeanors without bond, but leave violent offenders in there under the cash bond. And we've got to face that someday too.
We're done.
Well,
I-
Do you
you
have
know,
any
yeah.
comments on that, Hillary?
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Thank you, Counselor. Talking, you've mentioned several times the Chauvin trial. It appears you feel should be convicted. Do you think that if he is not given anything other than maximum penalty, that justice will be served and riots should be avoided by leaning towards that conviction?
So I think there is so we don't want to equalize things necessarily by saying, okay, he's a white man, let's give him a harsh sentence. I don't think that is really equality. And I'm kind of pro reducing sentences all around. So just because someone got a harsh sentence one time, I don't think means we should always give everybody a harsh sentence. If anything, I think sentences should come down in this country. But I believe he killed that man intentionally. And I think the evidence is so clear in this case. I hope he is convicted. I'm not going to say I think he should receive the harshest sentence. I don't know. I'm not the judge in that case. I don't have to make that tough call. I think if he's not convicted, there will be a problem and the justice system is broken. I actually wrote an article a number of years ago in this journal, Criminal Justice, about, it was really pro George Zimmerman. And not that I liked that guy, he killed Trayvon Martin, but I believed he was risking not receiving a fair trial because of all the publicity. And so my article was about how can we make sure publicity doesn't interfere with a fair trial. And so these high profile cases, when they're in the media, there is definitely a risk that a person's not going to receive a fair trial. I hope Derek Chauvin though is convicted. And I think the evidence it's solid. So
Well, the evidence we've seen so far, the point being that people are ready to burn an entire city down if they don't see a verdict that they agree with. So how is he going to get that fair trial? You've been a public defender, so I'm going to assume that in your deep heart you want him to get the fairest trial, and you've probably defended some people you knew were guilty, but wanted them to get the proper path through the criminal justice system, even if that meant they would get off lightly or maybe be found not guilty, so that others aren't found guilty incorrectly.
So, and a fair trial is not inconsistent with a guilty verdict. And I will end it there. That's my comment on that. Does anyone else have anything to say about the George Floyd trial? Rabbi, was that a hand? No.
No, I
Mr.
just want to check in about respect people's time. I think, moving towards ending our discussion, but so Bill's got his hand, Jerry's got his hand up. So go ahead, Jerry.
Hill, do you have any comments on prison reform? There's the controversy of private prisons and the state spending fortunes of money for profit prisons and stuff. I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I don't think there's anything much worse about a private prison versus a state prison. They're, I don't know if that drives incarceration. I don't know if, aside from the one judge, I think in Philadelphia or something, that was sentencing juveniles to prison because he was getting a kickback. I don't know how much private prisons are driving incarceration. I think it's all a problem. But I haven't done a ton of research on it.
Michelle Alexander talks a lot about private prisons in that book, The New Jim Crow that you mentioned. Yeah, it's a dense book, but I think also I saw a statistic that, private prisons, I think it's the prisonpolicy.org website that I quoted. I think they talk about private prisons are really only a fraction of prisons in America anyway. So it's part of it, but it's not the whole equation. And frankly, I have clients in prison right now in Colorado, all over the state, where I'm counsel that has been appointed to get them out after they were convicted, potentially with a ineffective attorney. And I have clients in prisons, some are private and some are state, and I don't know the difference. They're all the same. Me. Bill, you wanted to add something?
I was just wondering if you've read Bill Pitchey's book about he's a local professor, retired professor, and he recently published a book about where he goes through the Supreme Court cases, which were all written mostly by liberal judges in the early stages.
With regard to mass incarceration.
Yes.
Did he say Bill Pitchey?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had his class in law school, but I haven't read his book. But that sounds
interesting, I thought, because what he goes through is all the constitutional decisions, including Mapp versus Ohio, and the right to counsel, and whether you do it in the exclusionary rule and apply it to the states as well. He goes through all of those, and he says all of those were written for the benefit of the defendants, and they've had the opposite effect in the sense that they've transferred attention to the motions hearing rather than to the trial. And attorneys all use, and judges all use the motions verdict or the motions outcome as trial determinative. And then they push people into taking pleas because no one wants to go to trial, because there are more constitutional rights at the trial. And so who knows what's going to happen. And he really, his thrust is that it's basically a big thing on unintended consequences, and that we should be aware of that, and judges need to look back at those cases and not think of themselves as holier than thou and deciding things for all time. Anyway, it's an interesting book. It's a quick read too.
Sounds great.
Well, I think if not, I want to really thank you for your time and for very informative presentation. And I don't know if you want to add anything, Stephanie, but I will just say that next month we have a very, very different look at the law, looking at how Sharia law and halakha, Jewish law, are connected, with a Muslim scholar who's a professor at CU talking about those two. So I think it'll be very interesting. I know her personally, and I think it's going to be a very fascinating conversation. That's on May 6th. But Stephanie, anything you want to say on behalf of First Friday folks?
No, we will be, as we always do, skipping July, and then in all likelihood starting up on Zoom, I would think, in August. Am I correct in thinking that, Rabbi?
Yeah,
Zoom?
We do have a
Ms. Barr?
Zoom, we do have a Zoom one.
I don't know, we might be back in person.
Well, you never know, right? You never know.
I don't know. Dr.
uh,
Levine, do you think we should be back in person? Do you think we're ready medically to be back in?
Could have been months ago in my book.
Oh, geez, not in mine.
Well,
Yeah.
no one's making you.
Right. It's
So
true.
we'll keep everyone informed about where we're at with.
Yes. And the synagogue, of course, will keep the First Friday Committee informed on what we're supposed to be doing in that regard. Hillary, thank you so very much. This was really excellent. In order to fully understand, not being a lawyer, fully understand all the points you were making, I'd have to hear you all over again. So fortunately it was recorded, but you've given all of us some important things to think about. And the biggest takeaway for me personally is whether or not to call the police and to think about it. If you have time to think about it, think about it. That's one of the biggest takeaways for me personally. So thank you again. This has been really wonderful and really thought-provoking and a great learning opportunity.
Thank you all for attending, and thank you for the kind words. Be safe. Call the police if you do need them.
And thanks for the great work you do too.
Thank you.
Good night,
Bye, Hillary.
everyone. Thanks for coming.
Good night.